Many of the great philosophers and scientists, poets and statesmen of throughout history have described the experience of pure consciousness. Es freut mich sehr, heute mit Ihnen zu sprechen. Und es tut mir leid, dass ich kann nicht Deutsch sehr gut, also will ich wieder zurück zum Englisch gehen. I, I tried anyway. That was a first time I've spoken German in some time, but I am very delighted to be back in a German world in Austria, and I have something very great to share with you, and that is many years of research has brought me to the understanding that many of the great philosophers and scientists, poets and statesmen of throughout history have described the experience of pure consciousness. About 45 years ago, I began this research and I began asking a question of who, if anyone, has described pure consciousness. And I found over the years of these many years of research that about several hundred, 350, about different philosophers and scientists have described this experience. And it's not known because people don't see it. When the scientists and philosophers read the papers, the writings, they don't see this because they don't have a clear paradigm for understanding it. And Maharishi has brought out a very, very clear paradigm for understanding the experience that the philosophers were describing. And we'll see today that the great scientist Kepler, the great astronomer, Kant, Leibniz, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, they were all very much aware of pure consciousness, and they saw it as something fundamentally important. And this is what makes German philosophy great, is that it wasn't just speculation. It wasn't conjecture about some metaphysical world beyond, which is the way most people today see it. And at least in the Anglo-American world and the British empiricist world where we mostly live, I think even in Europe to some extent, the idea that German philosophy was something more than speculation, this never comes up. It's considered speculative theory. It's classified in histories of philosophy as speculative philosophy, meaning that they're guessing, they're making up theories, they're conjecturing about something outside the reach of human experience. And what I'm going to show, or at least I'll give you a glimpse today, that these were not speculating theorists. They were people who were transcending and experiencing pure consciousness. And not just pure consciousness, but the higher stages of development of consciousness that Maharishi has identified. As you know, Maharishi talks about pure transcendental consciousness, cosmic consciousness, God consciousness, and unity consciousness. And we'll see some expressions. I can't go into all of them today, but we'll see some from Hegel and a few from Fichte and Schelling and Kepler and Kant that describe pure consciousness and cosmic consciousness and unity consciousness. We'll see some of those expressions. So the point is that the meditation that you're engaged in, the practice of Maharishi's transcendental meditation movement and technique, that technique is a profound technique. And that was the technique, or something very like it, that Kant and Hegel and Fichte, Schelling and Leibniz and Kepler probably used. They were not just speculative theorists making up conjectures about a world beyond. They were describing the deepest level of human experience, the level that we attain when we transcend, when we go down to that very settled, quiet state of silence that is awake and self-knowing and simple and unbounded and unchanging, infinite, meaning not finite, but unbounded, and eternal, meaning not in time, but at the foundation of time. It's what was called in the German tradition ursprünglich, meaning, as you know, that can mean something very common, or it can refer to that which is primordial, first in the order of things, the most basic or in the order of existence. And that ursprünglich field of pure consciousness that the philosophers experienced is the same field that we can experience in our meditation, that we do experience in our meditation. At first, it may be very faint, but over time, the experience grows that this pure consciousness is something very, very significant. Kant considered it the most important concept in the entire sphere of human knowledge. And it was a very, very basic experience, not a speculative theory, but an experience that the philosophers of Germany described. And that's why I consider the German tradition of philosophy to be one of the very greatest in the history of civilization. The Greeks knew this experience. Plato and Aristotle, Socrates, Parmenides, Heraclitus, they all described this very experience, this very realm of experience, as I can show. But it was the Germans, probably more than anyone, who really developed this very, very clearly. The great Deutsche philosophische tradition was a very, very basic inquiry into the nature of consciousness. It wasn't philosophical disputation and argument and intellectual discussion. It was about the experience, and they had a technique. They had techniques. Partly they derived from Descartes, who taught a technique in Europe in the early 17th century. But more importantly, the German tradition grew out of a technique that was developed in Germany and described by Kant and by Hegel. And I'll give you the quotes that show this, that they were not speculating, they were describing the experience of the deepest level of consciousness. So that's by way of a short introduction to the whole picture. The whole picture is Maharishi's teaching and Maharishi's transcendental meditation technique is a way that anyone, that all of us, can and do have experience of that very simple state of self-knowing consciousness that was described in the great Germanic and Greek and Renaissance tradition throughout history in China and Egypt. I can show you passages from all different cultures that describe this experience. I'm going to begin now to go through some of the great minds of history who have described this experience of transcending and pure consciousness. Pure consciousness, you all know how to understand that. Pure consciousness is not something, it's not an abstract theory, it's a very simple experience of consciousness in its least excited and simplest state. Now, let's look at the chart very briefly of the bubble diagram. If you can see that, transcending, I define simply, and Maharishi defines as the simple settling of the activity of the mind while the mind remains awake. Anyway, so let's just look at that simple bubble diagram that Maharishi, I mean, you all know this. It's not anything new, but the practice of TM technique brings the mind to this deepest level of silent, universal, pure consciousness, consciousness at rest, and a simple, unchanging unity on a deeper level than activity and deeper than space and time. not in space and time, but the primordial, unbounded, timeless basis of space-time. So that's the state that I'm going to show that philosophers talked about, a state that's timeless and eternal. Eternal doesn't mean going on forever in an endless sequence. It means that you go to a level that's deeper than space and time by going to the deepest level of the mind, which is not in space, but at the basis of space-time. And Friedrich Schelling, if we could go to the Schelling slide now. We all have, he writes, Schelling writes, he was in the 19th century, a great 19th century philosopher, and he was a roommate of Hegel at Tübingen University. He said, we all, and I'm showing this first because it's so simple and clear that what he says. He says, we all have a secret and wondrous capacity of withdrawing from temporal change into our innermost self, which we divest of every exterior accretion. There, in the form of immutability, we intuit the eternal in us. This intuition is our innermost, and in the strictest sense, our own experience, our own Erfahrung. He's talking about experience. This is what you'll see if you read carefully the history of philosophy. The philosophers they not only describe pure consciousness exactly, they also say they experienced it. And many of them talk about a technique of settling the activity of the mind by which they experienced it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Johannes Kepler, the great astronomer who was the first to give exact evidence for the Copernican view of the universe. And Immanuel Kant called Kepler the most astute thinker ever born. Most astute thinker ever born. Well, that's a very high praise from someone like Kant, who was one of the most astute thinkers ever born. And Kepler took the tables of data that had been collected by the observations of Tycho Brahe in Denmark that describe the motions of the planets. You know, Saturn moves from this point to this point, and Mars moves from this point. There's tables and tables and tables of data. And what Kepler was able to discern is that the planets move around the sun in orbits that are not circular, but elliptical. They're only slightly elliptical, but they are elliptical orbits. And he found that the planets sweep out equal amounts of arc and equal amounts of time. This is Kepler's second law, and it's a law that describes precisely in mathematical terms how exactly the planets move, their speed and their relation to the arc that they draw out as they sweep around the sun. So Kepler was a major force in the development of modern science. He was the first to describe laws that characterize the way the planets actually move on the basis of empirical data. This is a huge, huge leap forward in science. And Galileo showed how that there was a law of falling bodies on the Earth. And then Newton developed equations on the basis of Kepler and Galileo that described laws of a more general nature about how the laws of gravity work. Now, Kepler was a huge, huge genius in the history of science. And we call him a genius, but what does genius mean? What is a genius? We don't have a very clear idea of that. Nobody has ever given a very compelling explanation of what a genius is. But what Kepler does in his own writings on called The Harmony of the World was his main book. He actually describes his experience of transcending. And he says, and I'm quoting here, if you're on the slide with Kepler's quote there, with the picture of Württemberg in the background. He was born, in Val d'Estat near in southern Germany, in Bayern. And Kepler says that and I'm quoting him here, he becomes aware, he says, when one enters the transcendental realm, he becomes aware that he has reached the light of truth. He is gripped by an incredible rapture, an incredible bliss, and exalting, he perceives with great precision, as from a high watchtower, the whole world, die ganze Welt. Now, how do you gain a perception of the whole world, an incredible rapture, except by transcending? Well, Kepler says it. He entered the transcendental realm. That was his experience, and that's the source of his genius. That's how he was able to experience the eternal laws of nature, because the eternal laws of nature, as we know from Maharishi's teaching, are structured in that state of transcendental pure consciousness. Natural law exists within pure consciousness. Aristotle says that the laws of nature are in pure consciousness as the colors are in sunlight. So colors are in sunlight in a unified state in the same way that the laws of nature exist in pure consciousness. So Kepler was moving among the timeless laws of nature within pure consciousness. His experience was that he describes this in very great detail. He could see the planets and the sun and the stars, the planets with his eyes. He could understand them and grasp them through mathematics, and he could hear them as a form of music. Mathematics, music, and astronomy were three aspects or three ways of knowing the same reality of the heavenly spheres, the planets moving around the sun. And his experience was that, and I'm quoting again on the next slide on Kepler, music reveals a transcendental world in which everything is as it should be, in which will and law agree, and truth in its beauty reveals itself to the perceiving mind. Whence this magic power comes, we know not. We only experience it. Kepler saw the laws of nature that are expressed in the outer world as expressions that he saw the outer world that we perceive through the senses as expressions of timeless laws structured in consciousness, exactly in the way that Maharishi describes that. The outer world is an instance of the eternal world, an example, an example of that timeless form of creative intelligence within the self. So Kepler was one who had that experience. Leibniz, I'm going to go into the slide on Leibniz. Leibniz was the founder of the calculus, or one of the mathematicians, great German mathematician, philosopher, statesman, who invented the calculus. Newton is also sometimes given credit for it, but there's a great controversy now about whether Leibniz or Newton discovered the calculus, and many people think that Leibniz was first and that Newton stole it from Leibniz. So it came from Germany, not England, if that's true. And Leibniz had some very, very deep experience of that experience. His experience was that consciousness is fundamental and that everything in nature is made of experience, and that he called the basic units of experience the monad. And they experience, the monads are experience, finite bits of consciousness that experience the world through from a finite perspective, but the whole of the universe is made up of experience or consciousness. And Leibniz writes, and here I'm quoting him in the passage on the slide, in addition to the world or aggregate of finite things, there is a unity which dominates, not only like the soul in me, or rather like the ego itself in my body, but in a much higher sense. He had an experience of the unity of the whole universe. And he writes about that in some detail. He also saw the particular finite beings, which he called monads, as finite expressions of that infinite wholeness. And the progress to supreme enlightenment he saw as happening when the finite individual monads grow in clarity until they can experience that unified whole of the universe. Kind of an expression of unity consciousness, I would say. Now, I want to talk just briefly about Immanuel Kant next. I know that Dr. Stein has given you many, many beautiful glimpses of what Kant is about, but I just want to very briefly mention Kant because he is so important, so clear, so profoundly clear in his analysis of consciousness that he is one of the very greatest of all philosophers. Kant identified a state of simple, pure, unchangeable, primordial consciousness. And that word primordial is the German ursprünglich, which can mean anything but primordial, but he meant it as an example of primordial. He was saying that it's primordial, it's basic to the universe. And he calls this primordial consciousness the transcendental unity of apperception. And he says we know it through a transcendental deduction. And that's led many people to think he was talking about a form of logical, that he was making a logical, intellectual case for consciousness. But if we read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, we see many very precise examples. I can list about 10 to 12 examples where he's actually describing his own awareness of transcendental consciousness and witnessing. He was witnessing at the time he wrote the critique. I think I can show that. But he wanted to show to the British empiricist world that this pure consciousness is the universal and necessary condition of any experience. And in this sense, he thinks he needs to deduce it or to show that it is derived from some kind of formal and necessary reasoning. He was talking about an experience, but he wanted to show why it is necessary. And this led many people to think that he was just doing intellectual reasoning about consciousness, but he was actually very clearly describing his own experience of transcendental consciousness and witnessing cosmic consciousness. And one of his biographers says that Kant sat in meditation for an hour each morning and evening and directed his attention from the sensory perception to the universal and necessary conditions of any experience. That's what he did in meditation. He says that's his method, directing his attention from the surface of sensory perception to the universal and necessary condition of any possible experience. So his transcendental deduction wasn't a logical deduction. It was a way of showing why pure consciousness is necessary condition. It's the necessary condition of there being any experience at all. And if you read his early writings on the universal natural history and theory of the heavens, Kant spoke about his own experience very explicitly of what he called the highest being, the unconditioned intelligence at the basis of all things. And I'm just going to read you one small passage from that. He says, at each step of the experience, as this experience unfolded, he said, I witnessed the clouds disperse and the splendor of highest being break forth with the most vivid brilliance. He's talking very directly about his experience of highest being, the unconditioned intelligence at the foundation of all things. And in the post-critical works after the Critique of Pure Reason in 1793, he actually says that the pure consciousness is the unconditioned actuality at the basis of all appearances, which he calls the thing in itself, the Ding an sich. Das reines Bewusstsein ist das Ding an sich. Now, I want to mention after Kant, I know this is going very fast, but I want you to have a glimpse of the greatness of German philosophy. Fichte was one who lived shortly after Kant, and I'll just read you one of his experiences. The universe appears before my eyes, clothed in a more glorious form. The dead inert mass, which only filled up space, has vanished, and in its place there flows onward, with its rushing music of mighty waves, an endless stream of life, power, and action, which issues from the original source of all life. From thy life, O infinite one, for all life is thy life. Everything is the life of the infinite one. Everything in nature, everything that exists, is an expression of that one infinite consciousness at the basis of all life. Now that, if you've followed Roger Rahm's talks, he talks a lot about consciousness being the primary reality, and he says that consciousness is all that there is. Well, that comes directly from the Upanishads, you probably know. And there are many who have experienced that fundamental reality of consciousness. And Fichte says, for all life is the life of that infinite one, that one infinite consciousness. So Fichte was one of the great philosophers of Germany. Now we're going to come to the probably, I consider one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And you see, are you on the page there with Hegel? That's I think, a beautiful painting depicting Hegel. If we're on the same page, I'll just move on from there. You see, a lot of the paintings that you see of Hegel don't present him quite so in such an elegant way, but here there's the next page is a bust of Hegel showing him as he probably more as he was. And Hegel, as I said, is not a speculative philosopher who was conjecturing about a metaphysical world beyond. What makes him a very important philosopher is that he was describing the experience that is gained on the deepest level of the mind, when the mind transcends. And philosophers, even though they're viewed as speculative theorists who are conjecturing about hypothetical reality beyond, were actually describing the deepest level of human experience. Now, I'll give you some evidence to back that up. In fact, everything I'm saying, I can show you. I can back up with plenty of evidence, and from in the words of the philosophers themselves. And we will see that Hegel speaks of his own experience of pure consciousness, cosmic consciousness, and unity consciousness, which he describes in the phenomenology of mind. And he describes the phenomenology of mind as a journey of a spiritual development. The name of the book is The Phänomenologie des Geistes, the phenomenology of spirit, which means for Hegel, the purely descriptive science of the experience of consciousness. He describes the sequential emergence of the one into the many and identifies the same self-interacting dynamics of consciousness that Maharishi describes. Now, that is a big claim because that's a very, very deep knowledge, and I will give you the evidence to show that. So I'm just going to go through the slides here and skip to the bust of Hegel. If we can go there. He calls his phenomenology of mind the odyssey of his spiritual development. The odyssey means a journey, a great, vast journey through the spiritual world as his mind developed. And he spoke of his phenomenology of mind as the exposition, the scientific exposition of the experience through which consciousness passes in the course of its development. So he's describing the development of consciousness. Well, as we know, Maharishi gives a very exact description of the development of consciousness. On to the next slide now is the title page from one of the early sections of Hegel's phenomenology. And if you've got that in front of you, I've put it in German there so you can read it. First part, erster Teil, die Wissenschaft von der Erfahrung des Bewusstseins, the science of the experience of consciousness, die Wissenschaft der Erfahrung des Bewusstseins. Erfahrung means experience, of course, or not experience through the senses or sensory perception, but the experience of consciousness in the course of its development, stages of the development of consciousness. So Hegel's phenomenology can be understood very simply as an attempt to do a scientific exposition von der Erfahrung des Bewusstseins, a scientific exposition of the experience of consciousness. Now, that's what it's really about. Now, his editor, after the first edition contains this page. And after that, I think his editors took it out because no one understood what kind of experience he was talking about. There was no way to understand the experience he was trying to describe. Now, we can understand it because we know how to transcend and to experience the deepest level of consciousness. And we experience the unfoldment of deeper and more coherent and more comprehensive experience as consciousness develops over time. Hegel tells how we come to know this pure consciousness, how we come to experience consciousness in its pure state. It's Hegel on how the timeless pure consciousness comes to be known. And the statement is, and this is very important because it tells you how we know consciousness, how we know this, how we gain this experience of consciousness. He says the condition of ecstasy, of Freude, I guess you would call it, through which alone that which has true being comes to be known, is a simplification of the soul, through which it is brought into a state of blissful repose, because its object is itself, simple and at rest. Being knows itself. Its object is itself. And it comes to this state when the mind is in a state of blissful repose, simple and at rest. Now, how many times have you heard Maharishi talk about simplicity and rest as the basic state of pure consciousness? Pure consciousness is consciousness settled down to a state of simple rest. Hegel is talking about that exact same experience of transcending. And I can show you many more passages in which he describes it that way. The simplification of the soul or consciousness, soul is another word for consciousness, through which it is brought into a state of blissful repose, rest, simple and at rest, simple and at rest. It's very, very simple and clear. He wrote in the next slide, Hegel on how the timeless consciousness comes to be known. He wrote in a poem to his roommate Tübingen, to his fellow roommate Hölderlin, the poet Hölderlin, of one who sinks out of space and time in a presentment of infinity, and again to consciousness now awakens. And whoever tried to speak to this to others will feel the poverty of words. It can't be expressed in words. It's so magnificent, so glorious, so splendid that it cannot be described in words. Now, Hegel uses the term pure consciousness, reines Bewusstsein, in the phenomenology of Geistes about 59 times to refer to this simple, unchanging, self-identical pole of human experience. He attributes to this state the same properties that we know pure consciousness to have. What are the properties of pure consciousness? You know them from Maharishi. You know them. We know them from many, many times Maharishi has used these terms to characterize pure consciousness. It's simple, it's unchanging, it's unbounded, it's universal, it's a necessary, unbounded, simple, unchangeable consciousness. He calls it the bare and simple infinity. The self-same and its essence is unity, unconditioned, absolute universality, boundless, pure consciousness, and therefore simple and therefore unchanging consciousness. He calls it unconditioned being, infinitude, the succession or supersession of all distinctions, itself at rest. He calls it, this is very, very telling. He calls it the self-referring and self-relating identity and simplicity. He calls it wholly simple existence, the absolute simple and unitary, simple unity with itself. All exact descriptions of pure consciousness that Maharishi has used. He calls it serene unity with itself, limitless knowing, the absolute one, wholly abstract subjectivity, the I as perfectly simple and universal, the unity in which pure knowing withdraws. He calls it pure indeterminateness, the simplest of all things, pure self-knowing, simple immediacy, pure being, the I, which is the vacuum or receptacle for anything and everything. Again, all terms that Maharishi has used. And finally, Hegel uses the terms to describe pure consciousness. It says it's the I, which is the existence of a wholly abstract universality, the principle of abstract freedom. The I, which is the primary identity, at one with itself and at home in itself. Transcendental self-consciousness, which is identical with itself and infinite in itself. Well, if we look at a list of properties of pure consciousness that Maharishi has used, I'm going to jump over to the next page, which is a list of 108 properties that Maharishi has identified as descriptions of pure consciousness. It's silent, it's eternal being, it's conscious, it's bliss. And you recognize all these: one, simple, unchanging, silence, rest, unmanifest, quietness, settled, stillness, sameness, evenness, abstract, undifferentiated, qualityless, formless and immutable, self-singular and self-sufficient. Well, we don't need to go all through these, but you know them. They're all properties that are extensively described in the ancient Vedic tradition: eternal being, consciousness, and bliss. Sat, Chit, Ananda in the Vedic tradition. This is what Maharishi describes as pure consciousness, and it's exactly what Hegel talks about. He gives it the name, reines Bewusstsein. And he describes reines Bewusstsein exactly in these terms. The terms that I've read you from Hegel are a subset of these terms that are used to describe pure consciousness in the great Vedic tradition, in the Renaissance, in the 17th century, and the great Deutsches Philosophische Erbes. Now, one more slide here after the slide on the properties of pure consciousness. Hegel again describes pure consciousness. He says, common fancy puts the absolute far away in a world beyond. The absolute is rather directly before us, so present that so long as we think, we must always carry it with us and always use it. What is the absolute? Reines Bewusstsein, pure consciousness, the unconditioned, the simple, the unchanging basis of everything. And that's what we experience when we transcend and go beyond the world of finite things to experience the infinite, unbounded, pure consciousness. I'm going to give you just one brief quote from Hegel describing cosmic consciousness. The next slide on cosmic consciousness. Hegel characterizes cosmic consciousness as a dual awareness, with consciousness of the self on one side and consciousness of the changeable objects of the world on the other. The state has a dual form, he says: the object of sense, certainty, and perception on one side, and on the other, itself, consciousness knowing itself. Next slide on cosmic consciousness. He says, and again I'm quoting, we see the tremendous difference on the one side of the I, this wholly simple existence, and on the other side of the infinite variety of the world. This is his characterization of cosmic consciousness. The I on one side, the simple, wholly simple existence, and on the other side, the infinite variety of the world. And that's how Maharishi characterizes cosmic consciousness: knowledge of the self, along with, but separate from, the knowledge of the world. They're two together in the awareness at the same time. Now, the next slide is a picture of Heidelberg University, where Hegel was professor for many years. And now I want to talk briefly about the transition from cosmic to unity consciousness. He sees a transition occurring when the duality of self and the world begins to transform into unity. It transforms through devotion, the practice of devotion to God. In the state of duality, the self is experienced to be infinite and eternal, but it is projected in the dual state of cosmic consciousness. We project the idea of God onto an otherworldly realm, an otherworldly God, and human life is considered, by contrast, lowly and weak. Next slide is Hegel's birthplace in Stuttgart in southwest Germany. Then some expressions of unity consciousness next. He says that existence and self-consciousness are the same being, the same not as a matter of comparison, but really and truly in and for themselves. Self-consciousness is existence. It is the thing in itself. It is the ultimate reality. Consciousness is now aware of itself as the pure essential being of things, as well as their aspect of difference. Consciousness is all that is. Consciousness is primary. Consciousness is the essential being of things, as well as their aspect of difference. Next slide on unity consciousness. Consciousness is known to embrace all reality and to know itself as the all-pervading reality. And again, this is a direct quote. Consciousness is the certainty of being all reality, of being both itself and its object. All objectivity, all subjectivity is consciousness in different forms of knowing itself. This is, again, just remind you, Roger Ram often uses that expression, consciousness is all that there is. One more slide on unity consciousness. And Hegel writes, next slide, we must, of course, distinguish being, which is absolutely immediate, indeterminate, and undifferentiated from the I. Yet, on the other hand, being is identical with the I, since the latter returns from every object mediation to immediacy, from all self-differentiation to a serene unity with itself. The I is, therefore, being. And finally, he speaks, this is one more quote in the next slide, Hegel on unity consciousness. This curtain of appearances that hangs before the inner world is withdrawn, and we have here the inner being, the I, gazing into the inner realm, the vision of the undistinguished self-same reality. The I knows itself as the inner realm. And finally, I want to talk just briefly, and I hope this is not too crowded and too fast, but Hegel's logic, the other major work that he wrote. He wrote two versions of the logic, but the larger logic and the lesser logic, and the larger logic is the, well, both, the theme of both is the theme of how the eternal one becomes the many. It knows itself, and in the process of knowing itself, consciousness creates the mechanics of creation. The mechanics of creation come out of consciousness itself. How do they come out? Consciousness, in knowing itself, moves from opposite to opposite. And the ultimate opposites are the forms through which consciousness moves in the process of knowing itself. And I'll just mention a few of them here in this list of opposites, of ultimate opposites. The one and the many, the unchanging and the changing, the infinite and the finite, rest, activity, eternal and the temporal, the absolute, the relative, the universal, the particular, sameness, difference, knower, known, subject, object, being and non-being, and so on. Now, if you happen to have had listened to Maharishi's lectures on Vedic science, the Vedic knowledge core course, Maharishi identifies these same terms, being and non-being, one and many, as the basic forms of existence that come out of consciousness knowing itself, becoming aware of itself. Being and non-being and becoming are the three categories that Hegel identifies. Maharishi identifies those same three categories as coming out of the process of being, knowing itself. Well, this is what Maharishi calls the self-interacting dynamics of consciousness. Consciousness, Hegel says, does not create the world outside itself. It creates the world by withdrawing within itself and creating distinctions within itself. The entire universe exists within the eternal whole of pure consciousness. When we attain pure consciousness, we know the universe within our own self, within our own consciousness. Now, I wish I had, I'm just giving you an overview of Hegel here. It would be fun sometime to go into the details of all the different categories Hegel develops and how he develops them. You know, when Maharishi talks about the structure of Vedic science and the ancient Vedic literature, he identifies groups of three: knower, knowing, and known, unfolding from the knower to the knowing to the known, and then from the known back through the knowing to the knower, in packages of six. And there's six of those packages in the Vedic literature, each with six steps, and they all have the same form of describing consciousness in its process of knowing itself. And it's from this self-knowing process that we can witness on that deepest level of experience how the eternal one generates the universe from itself. It creates the finite within itself, it enters into the finite world, and then the finite beings like us come back to know ourselves as infinite. And all the other opposites, all the other forms of being and non-being, and one and many, and knower and known, are generated from this process of consciousness knowing itself. I can show you, I hope sometime we'll have a chance to go more into it. And we can see that all of Hegel's logic is about the same self-interaction of consciousness generating the laws and forms of nature from within itself. It creates the observed universe in the process of knowing itself, interacting with itself. And this is exactly the process that Maharishi calls the self-interacting dynamics of consciousness. And has a very definite form, this process of self-knowing. Hegel identifies essentially the same process as Maharishi. It's a move from being to its opposite and back, to its opposite of non-being and back to itself. And this creates the process of becoming. Maharishi talks about it the same way. The form of the process is from knower to process of knowing and back, generating Hegel. This process Hegel identifies as generating 36 distinct categories, 6 by 6 categories, each having that form of going out, coming back to itself, going out, coming back to itself. And that's essentially what we experience every time we transcend, going out, going from the outer to the inner. We then come out on thoughts and go back to the self, come out on thoughts, go back to the self. The cities are the same logic: out, coming back to the self, going out and coming back to the self. Now, I'm going to finish up now so we can have some time for questions. Let me just briefly mention this next slide on the 40 categories is a list of 40 categories of Hegel's logic. 40, same number of categories that Maharishi identifies in Vedic science, exactly the same number. They're different slightly, name from the categories that Maharishi's identified, but Hegel's categories basically are the categories of that process of consciousness knowing itself by going out to its object and coming back to itself. In other words, Hegel is saying the human mind has the capacity to know in direct experience the process by the eternal one consciousness generates from within itself all the different forms of life and existence, all the different laws of nature. And the next slide after that list of categories, I just want to mention one beautiful quote here that comes from Hegel, and you may recognize it if you know Maharishi's Advanced Vedic Science. And Hegel asks it in the logic, how does the pure vowel of the self get its consonant? What brings determinateness into indeterminateness? How does the vowel of the self get its consonant? Now, you know, the answer that Maharishi gives to that is that in the infinite, the sound of the infinite, collapses to ka in the first word of the Rig Veda, and that is how the pure vowel of the self gets its consonant, the ka, to ka, ak, ni mile purohitam yagyasa devam. That process of the Rig Veda is about the same reality that Hegel is describing. Different words, different forms of expression, but they're both talking about the same reality that the human mind can experience. We can experience that, we can know that. Now, in the empiricist tradition of Britain, which now dominates most of the world, the belief is that the human knowledge is very limited. We're limited to what we can know through the senses. And that gives rise to the empiricist tradition or the empiricist theory that all we can know is objectivity, the objects we view through the senses. Now, Hegel has brought out a different concept of how knowledge is gained. We gain knowledge through transcending. And Maharishi has brought to light that this deeper level of consciousness the philosophers were describing is a process we can all experience. We can now understand what the greatness of German philosophy was about. And now I'm talking from the slides with Maharishi's picture there. We can now understand that the German philosophers were doing something very great. They were exploring how we can get ultimate knowledge through the experience of the deepest level of consciousness, which is universal, primordial, unconditioned. Philosophy was not mere speculation and conjecture, but direct experience attained in transcending and exploring the deeper levels of the mind. Next slide on Maharishi. We know that Maharishi has made available throughout the world a practice by which anyone can directly experience the universal consciousness. He's made available techniques that enable anyone to attain the highest state of consciousness and know the unconditioned consciousness at the foundation of existence. Maharishi called this the blueprint of the universe, and Hegel is right with that. I mean, he sees the same potential of human knowledge. And this is what the German philosophers were about. And the last slide, through the effortless, simple practice of the TM technique, anyone can transcend and explore the deepest level of consciousness. We have the capacity to gain total knowledge, total understanding, total bliss, total fulfillment through this simple practice. Of course, in the short term, we just innocently do our program and we don't anticipate anything. We just enjoy the daily increase of clarity and coherence and joyfulness and understanding. But the goal of the whole thing is the same as the goal of Hegel's and Kant's philosophy, the ultimate knowledge of the self, and knowledge of the self as the totality of existence. So that's the presentation I wanted to give to you, and I hope it makes some sense. It's kind of a very fast tour of German philosophy in the 19th, from the 17th to the 19th century. And I wish we had time. I would love to talk about the German physicists who made incredible discoveries in physics and also were people who were transcending. Einstein, Schrödinger, Planck. These people were people who were transcending, and they were exploring the deepest level of consciousness. And that's how they came up with these magnificent understandings of nature, by going deep within the self. And that's the technique that we're practicing every day, and especially now during this residence course. So please, I'm sorry to take so much time. I hope you can have many questions and I can try to answer them. Beautiful question. Beautiful. Did everyone understand that? I hope it's a very good question. That and there's a very clear answer that Hegel gives, and it's the same answer Maharishi gives. The eternal one is always eternally one. But in knowing itself, it creates the finite individual, the finite individual within itself. It collapses from its infinity to its point. And in collapsing from infinity to the point, it becomes finite. The infinite becomes finite. And when the infinite becomes finite, it thinks of itself as finite. We think we're finite beings. But as we grow and evolve and into the full knowledge of who we are, the finite realizes it is infinity, and it was infinity all along. So the infinite has always been infinite. It's always been one. It's always been eternal. It never really goes anywhere, but it goes through the illusion of being finite so that it can have the joy and infinite knowledge of coming back to itself and knowing itself as infinite. So it is eternally infinite and unchanging, and all that comes out of that, all of the diversity of creation, is just the finite expression of infinity knowing itself. And it's very real in the sense that we experience finitude. I mean, we experience being finite beings, and we experience our finitude in a finite world of finite things all around. But as we evolve and our consciousness develops, we go to deeper and deeper levels until we experience the infinite wholeness, the infinite, unbounded, eternal whole of consciousness. And then we come back from our finite to the infinite and realize that we all along were nothing but infinity. Now, this is the beauty of German philosophy. I could show you in the Upanishads, passages in the Upanishads that say the same thing, that we are always infinite, but we forget it. Consciousness forgets its infinitude and enters into the finite. Having created the world, consciousness enters into the world in a finite form and then comes back to know itself as infinite. Now, this is it's a very abstract understanding of things, but infinity goes through this process of change in itself, within itself. It enters from infinity into a point. Infinity collapses to a point. It contracts to a point of infinity into infinitely many points. And then the points evolve and over time regain knowledge of infinity itself. I think the German philosopher, the German mind, the German heritage is very, very great, very, very deep. And this is very deep knowledge. I mean, it's knowledge, it's the cutting edge. Hegel was 200, 300 years way ahead of his time. And I think that our narrow forms of empiricist thinking, that science is the only way to know through objective, it is one way, it is an important way. Science is a very important way of knowing, but it's only one way. There are two ways. And the other way of knowing is through transcending. This was the technique that the German, and also Descartes in France, and Locke and Berkeley England, and well, Plato and Aristotle, there were many others who had this experience and who used this technique. I can show you that Socrates used a technique of transcending on sound if we had the time. We don't have we can't do everything in one lecture, but I just want to express my joy and my love for German thought. It's very, very great. Very, very great.
Okay. We have more.
I have another question. Is there any mention where they get their techniques from? Do they somehow something invent themselves something, find themselves something, or did they have some kind of tradition or from the medieval age, maybe? Meister Ecke?
Yes, very good question. I think the answer to that is basically modern philosophy grows out of Descartes. Descartes, the French philosopher in the 17th century, he went to a Jesuit school where he learned a technique. He describes the technique in his meditations on first philosophy, his greatest, the beginning of modern philosophy. And he describes the technique that he learned. He says, I'm going to put down my pen. I'm going to close my eyes. I'm going to stop up my ears. I'm going to remove thoughts as far as possible and get to know my inner self. Get to know my inner self. And he says, when I find that I've wandered off my mind, when I find that my mind has wandered off on thoughts, I gently bring it back to the self. That was the technique he used. It sounds like he's talking about transcendental meditation, doesn't it? And he is talking about a technique that he used, and nobody sees it because they don't understand. They don't have the context that you do, that we do. They don't have the context to understand it, so it gets missed. It's missed entirely. Now, the technique that Descartes learned, he learned in a Jesuit school founded by St. Ignatius Loyola, who had a brilliant experience of transcending. And then he went into a monastery and learned a technique of meditation from a man named Garcia's. Anyway, the technique had come through the medieval realm from a very early source in the 6th century BC, which was, no, I'm sorry, the 6th century AD. The 6th century, a man named Dionysius the Areopagite. If you've ever heard of him, he's very important to the Middle Ages. And he had a technique of transcending on names, transcending on sound. That's the technique that was taught in the monastery. That's the technique that Loyola learned. And I think that's the technique that Descartes learned, well, I think that's the technique that Descartes learned in his own experience, in his Jesuit training. That's the technique that Descartes learned. And that's the technique that came from Descartes into all of Europe: Leibniz, Spinoza, Berkeley, Kant, Hegel. I think they all learned that technique that Descartes taught. He taught a technique of transcending. He actually mentions it in his meditations, in the most famous book of Western philosophy, probably. Nobody understands it and nobody gets it, but that's what he was talking about. Descartes had a technique and it was learned throughout Europe and passed throughout Europe. So that the Europeans, namely the Germans especially, picked up on that technique and learned it. And Kant describes it in the Critique of Pure Reason. It's called the transcendental deduction, meaning I'm going to go from sensory experience to the universal and necessary conditions of experience. Think of the double bubble diagram, going to go to the pure consciousness as the universal and necessary condition of all possible experience. So I think the German tradition comes through that tradition that started in the Middle Ages in the 6th century with Dionysius the Areopagite. He's now known as, well, I don't want to get too much into it. Let's just stop there. That's how it came into Germany.